Sometimes, the people who seem the hardest to love are the ones carrying the deepest pain. When Ethan rented a room in Luke Donovan's house, he expected nothing more than a fresh start. Instead, he uncovered a past filled with grief, prejudice, and secrets that would change both of their lives forever. First thing Luke Donovan ever said to me was, "If you're one of those gay guys who thinks everyone has to accept you, this isn't the house for you." Most people would have turned around right there, but I was standing on his front porch with one duffel bag, $312 left in my checking account, and nowhere else to sleep. Pride doesn't pay rent. Sometimes survival means walking straight into the kind of place your instincts beg you to avoid. The house sat at the edge of Ashwood, Oregon. Surrounded by towering fir trees that blocked out the afternoon sun, it looked older than every other home on the road, with faded gray siding, a wraparound porch that creaked beneath my sneakers, and flower boxes that hadn't held flowers in years. Luke opened the front door without smiling. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered from years of physical work, wearing a plain dark t-shirt dusted with sawdust and worn jeans. His expression wasn't angry. It was something colder than anger, the kind of face someone learns after carrying too much for too long. He glanced at the rainbow sticker on my old suitcase before looking back at me. "You're Noah?" he asked. I nodded. "The room's upstairs. Rent's due every Friday. Utilities are included. Keep the kitchen clean." Then he paused just long enough to make sure I was listening. "5 rules. Don't ask me about my past. Don't bring strangers into my house. Don't open the last room at the end of the hallway. Don't touch the wooden box on the living room shelf. And if you ever hear someone calling my name after midnight," his voice flattened even further, "don't open your bedroom door." I laughed because the rules sounded like something out of a cheap horror movie. But Luke didn't laugh back. "I'm serious." The silence that followed was uncomfortable enough to make me swallow the joke I almost made. He handed me a brass key without another word and walked outside toward a detached workshop behind the house. Through the open door, I could hear the steady rhythm of woodworking tools echoing into the woods. My bedroom was surprisingly clean, almost too clean, as if no one had stayed there in years. Only decoration was a small window overlooking the trees. Across the hallway stood another door painted white like the rest, except its handle was wrapped with a strip of faded blue cloth. Something about it immediately pulled at my curiosity. I reached for the knob before remembering rule number 3. Don't open the last room. I told myself it wasn't my business. People were allowed to have private spaces. After unpacking my clothes, I drove into town for groceries. Every cashier, waitress, and gas station clerks seemed to know Luke's name. None of them smiled when they mentioned him. One older woman quietly asked if I was renting his spare room. When I said yes, she looked at me with an expression that felt more like sympathy than surprise. "Just be careful," she whispered before changing the subject. That night the house settled into complete silence. No television, no music, just the distant wind brushing against the trees outside my window. I checked my phone one last time before turning off the lamp. It was exactly 12:17 a.m. when I heard it. A young man's voice drifted through the hallway, soft enough that I wondered if I had imagined it. "Luke." The voice came again, almost like someone speaking through an old recording. "Luke, if you ever hear this." Every hair on my arms stood up. I remembered the 5th rule. Don't open your bedroom door. I sat frozen in the darkness, staring at the handle as another faint whisper floated through the empty hallway. And for the first time since moving to Ashwood, I realized Luke's rules might not have been about keeping me out. They might have been about keeping something else in. I did not sleep again after hearing that voice. Every creak in the hallway sounded like another whisper waiting to happen. And by sunrise I had convinced myself there had to be a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe an old speaker hidden somewhere. Maybe a timer. Maybe the house simply had a strange way of settling at night. Whatever it was, I promised myself I would not ask Luke. Rule number 1 made it painfully clear that questions were not welcome here. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the hallway the next morning. Luke was already in the kitchen, reading the local newspaper while eating scrambled eggs with mechanical precision. He barely looked up when I walked in. "Coffee is on the stove," he said. "If you finish it, make another pot." I poured myself a mug and waited for him to mention the strange voice from the night before. He never did. Instead, he folded the newspaper, stood, grabbed his truck keys, and headed toward the front door. "I will be at the workshop until 6. Lock the front door if you leave." "That is it?" I asked. "That is all." The door closed behind him before I could say anything else. Living with Luke felt like sharing space with someone who had built invisible walls around every part of his life. Yet those walls had odd little cracks. When I returned from my first day at the publishing office, I discovered the loose hinge on my bedroom door had somehow been repaired. I knew I had not fixed it. The old squeak was completely gone. Later that evening, I found a new light bulb installed in the hallway lamp that had flickered the night before. Luke never mentioned either repair. 2 days later, my aging sedan refused to start outside the grocery store. I sighed, already calculating how much a tow truck would destroy what little money I had left. Before I even opened my phone to search for a mechanic, an old pickup rolled into the parking lot. Luke stepped out carrying a toolbox without saying hello. He opened the hood, tightened a battery cable, replaced a worn connector from a small box in his truck, and closed the hood again. "Try it now." The engine started immediately. "How much do I owe you?" I asked. "Nothing. At least let me buy you dinner." He looked at me for a long second before shaking his head. "Save your money." Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away before I could thank him properly. None of it made sense. This was the same man who barely tolerated my presence at breakfast, yet he somehow appeared whenever I needed help. By the end of the first week, I had started noticing even more strange habits. Every evening, exactly at 5:30, he checked every window in the house. Every night before going upstairs, he tested the front door twice. Every morning, he left precisely at 7:15. His life moved like clockwork until Friday afternoon. When I came home soaked after getting caught in an unexpected rainstorm, I sneezed twice before making it to my room. By midnight, I was shivering beneath 2 blankets with a pounding headache. I remembered hearing my bedroom door open just enough for footsteps to cross the floor. I pretended to stay asleep. A cool hand rested against my forehead for only a second before disappearing. A bottle of fever medicine and a glass of water were placed carefully on my nightstand. The footsteps retreated as quietly as they had come. When I opened my eyes a few moments later, the hallway was empty, but the bedroom door had been left slightly open. From somewhere farther down the hall, beyond the room I was forbidden to enter, I heard the faint click of a cassette player starting, followed by the same familiar voice whispering softly, "Luke, you promised you would listen this time?" The next morning I woke up feeling well enough to convince myself I had imagined the cassette player. Fever could twist ordinary sounds into strange memories, and that explanation felt much safer than believing someone was speaking through the walls of the house every night. Luke was already outside before I came downstairs. Through the kitchen window, I watched him stacking freshly cut cedar boards with calm, practiced movements. He looked exactly like the same distant man who barely spoke more than a few words each day. Yet I could not forget the cool touch against my forehead or the medicine he had quietly left beside my bed. He acted like someone who wanted me to leave him alone while constantly making sure I was all right. Those 2 versions of Luke refused to fit together. Life settled into an odd routine over the next several days. I worked at the publishing office until late afternoon, then returned home where Luke disappeared into his workshop until sunset. We shared dinners in near silence, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Still, I began noticing details that were impossible to ignore. My favorite cereal somehow appeared in the pantry after I mentioned missing it. Once at breakfast, the broken zipper on my backpack had been replaced while I was at work. One rainy evening, I found an extra umbrella leaning against the front door with a small handwritten note that simply read, "Forecast says storms all week." There was no signature because there did not need to be one. I thanked Luke anyway. He shrugged without looking up from sanding a wooden tabletop. "It was just an umbrella. You always say everything is just something," I replied. "Just a repair, just medicine, just coffee. You make it sound like none of it matters." He stopped sanding for the first time since I had walked into the workshop. His eyes met mine only briefly. Sometimes the things that matter the most are the ones people never talk about. Before I could ask what he meant, his phone rang. The name on the screen was Travis. Luke's expression changed immediately, growing tighter than I had ever seen before. He answered with only a quiet hello and listened for nearly a full minute without speaking. Finally he said, "No. He does not know anything." My stomach tightened. He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and noticed me standing there. "You need something?" he asked. "No," I answered, although I wanted 100 different explanations. That Saturday, I decided to explore the small downtown area of Ashwood. Everyone seemed friendly until they learned where I lived. The reactions were always the same. Polite smile disappeared. The conversation changed. One elderly man inside a hardware store stared at me for several seconds before quietly asking, "Has Luke opened that room yet?" I frowned. "What room?" The man looked startled, as though he had already said too much. "Forget I asked." He walked away before I could stop him. The question stayed with me all afternoon. That night, I returned home earlier than expected and found Luke's truck missing from the driveway. The house was completely silent. I stood in the hallway staring at the closed white door wrapped with faded blue cloth. Rule number 3 echoed in my mind. But so did every unanswered question from the past 2 weeks. Before I could talk myself out of it, I reached into the kitchen junk drawer searching for something thin enough to slide between the door and the frame. Just as my fingers closed around an old plastic loyalty card, I heard tires crunching across the gravel outside. Luke was back far earlier than usual. I shoved the card into my pocket and stepped away from the hallway, pretending I had been looking for a flashlight. As he walked through the front door, he looked directly at me, then at the closed room behind me. Neither of us spoke. For a long moment, the only sound inside the house was the ticking of the old grandfather clock, and somehow that silence felt louder than any whisper I had heard in the middle of the night. Luke never asked why I had been standing in the hallway, and I never admitted how close I had come to breaking his rule. Somehow that uneasy silence changed something between us. It was as if we had both realized there were questions neither of us was ready to answer, yet neither of us wanted the other to leave. The following morning, I found him loading lumber into his truck before sunrise. Without looking at me, he tossed a second pair of work gloves onto the porch. "If you are bored today, the vegetable garden needs help." It sounded less like an invitation and more like an assignment, but it was the longest sentence he had spoken to me in days. I followed him outside anyway. The neglected garden behind the house had become overgrown with weeds. We spent hours pulling vines, replacing broken fence posts, and turning the soil beneath a bright Oregon sky. Luke worked with quiet confidence, occasionally pointing toward a stubborn root or handing me another tool before I even realized I needed it. Around noon, I made sandwiches while he filled 2 glasses with iced tea. We sat on opposite ends of the porch steps, watching hummingbirds dart between the trees. "This place must have looked beautiful once," I said. Luke stared toward the empty flower beds. "Someone used to take care of it." "What happened?" He was quiet for so long that I regretted asking. Finally, he answered without looking at me. "Life happened." It was not much of an answer, but it was more personal than anything he had shared before. Over the next week, those quiet moments became surprisingly common. We repainted the old kitchen cabinets together after I accidentally mentioned the faded color. We drove into town for hardware supplies, and although Luke barely spoke during the trip, he remembered exactly which coffee I preferred and handed it to me before I even ordered. In the evenings, we sometimes watched old baseball games on television. I joked about never understanding half the rules, and for the first time I heard him laugh. It was brief and almost reluctant, but it completely changed his face. He looked younger, lighter, like someone who had forgotten how to smile until that exact moment. I caught myself watching him longer than I should have. He noticed. Our eyes met across the living room, and neither of us looked away immediately. The room suddenly felt much quieter than usual. Luke cleared his throat and stood up. "I should check the workshop." He disappeared outside before I could say anything. Later that night, I carried a basket of clean laundry upstairs. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed the faded blue cloth hanging from the forbidden door had slipped halfway to the floor. The door itself was not completely closed. A narrow gap revealed only darkness inside. I knew I should have walked away. Instead, I gently pushed the cloth aside and looked through the opening. Moonlight reached just far enough to illuminate a wooden desk, an old cassette recorder, and dozens of neatly stacked journals. Resting in the center of the desk was a framed photograph of a young man standing beside Luke. They looked almost identical except for the younger man's brighter smile. Before I could see anything else, a calm voice came from directly behind me. "Noah." I turned so quickly that the laundry basket slipped from my hands, scattering folded clothes across the hallway. Luke did not sound angry. Somehow that frightened me even more. His eyes shifted from the open door to the photograph inside the room before settling on me. After a long silence, he quietly asked, "Did you see his face?" For a moment, I could not answer. I simply nodded. The young man in the photograph looked so much like Luke that they could have been twins. Except his smile carried a warmth I had never seen on Luke's face. Luke stepped past me without another word, gently pushed the door open the rest of the way, and walked inside. I expected him to order me out, but instead he stood beside the desk with his back to me. "His name was Caleb," he finally said. "My younger brother." The room felt untouched by time. Dust floated through thin beams of moonlight, but every object rested exactly where it belonged. The cassette recorder sat beside neatly stacked journals, and shelves held model airplanes, baseball trophies, and old family photographs. It did not look abandoned. It looked preserved, like someone had been waiting for its owner to come home. I quietly stepped inside, careful not to touch anything. Luke noticed but did not stop me. His eyes remained fixed on the framed photograph. "People in town like to talk," he said. "Most of them only know half the story." Before I could ask another question, he reached over and pressed the play button on the cassette recorder. The tape hissed softly before the same familiar voice filled the room. "Hey, Luke. If you were listening to this, you probably ignored me again." The voice carried an easy laugh that immediately made the silence inside the house feel less heavy. "I know you hate serious conversations, so I figured maybe you would listen if I was not standing in front of you." Luke quickly pressed the stop button before the recording could continue. His hand remained on the machine for several seconds. "That is enough." I looked at him carefully. "You play it every night." He gave the smallest nod. I promised myself I would never forget his voice. We stood there without speaking until the grandfather clock downstairs chimed 10 times. Finally, Luke turned toward the doorway. "Please leave the room the way you found it." I followed him out, closing the door gently behind us. The next few days were different. Luke no longer avoided every conversation. He still spoke very little, but the distance between us had become quieter instead of colder. We ate dinner together almost every evening. Sometimes he even asked how work was going. One Saturday afternoon, he surprised me by driving us into town to buy lumber for a new bookshelf he insisted my room needed. While we loaded the truck outside the hardware store, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. A man in his early 30s stepped out wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform. He smiled at Luke first, then his eyes settled on me. The smile disappeared almost instantly. "So this is your new tenant," he said. Luke answered with a short, "His name is Noah." The deputy extended his hand anyway. "Travis Bennett." I shook it politely, but something about the way he studied me made me uncomfortable. His attention shifted back to Luke. "Can we talk for a minute?" They walked a few feet away, speaking quietly enough that I could not hear most of the conversation. I caught only a few words carried by the wind. "Still keeping secrets?" Travis asked. Luke replied in a calm but firm voice. "Some promises are not mine to break." Travis glanced toward me again before climbing back into his cruiser. As he drove away, Luke stood perfectly still, watching the taillights disappear around the corner. On the ride home, neither of us said a single word. That night, long after Luke had gone upstairs, I noticed something tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my car. It was a folded piece of paper with no name written on it. Inside, in neat block letters, were only 2 sentences. If Luke ever tells you why Caleb disappeared, ask him what really happened the night of the fire. I folded the note 3 times before slipping it into my wallet, but its words refused to stay hidden. The night of the fire, Caleb disappeared. Ask Luke what really happened. Every sentence felt carefully designed to make me question everything I had started believing. For the first time since moving into the house, I wondered if the quiet man who fixed my car, left medicine by my bed, and remembered my favorite coffee was also hiding something far darker than grief. I did not sleep much that night. The next morning Luke was already making pancakes when I came downstairs. An unexpected sight considering he normally settled for black coffee and toast. He slid a plate toward me, without saying anything. "You remembered I like blueberries," I said quietly after noticing them mixed into the batter. He shrugged. "You mentioned it once." It amazed me that someone who claimed to dislike talking remembered tiny details most people forgot within minutes. I almost asked him about the note, but the calm expression on his face stopped me. Instead, I asked if he needed help at the workshop. He nodded, and we spent the afternoon building the bookshelf he had promised. Hours passed with the steady rhythm of saws, sandpaper, and quiet conversation. For the first time, working beside Luke felt easy. He even smiled when I accidentally measured one board upside down and insisted it was modern art instead of bad math. "You are terrible with a tape measure," he said. "I work with books, not lumber," I answered. "That explains a lot." His laugh came again, softer this time, and somehow hearing it felt like discovering another hidden room inside the house. As the sun dipped lower, we carried the finished bookshelf into my bedroom. While adjusting it against the wall, I noticed an old storage box tucked beneath my bed. "Was this already here?" I asked. Luke looked surprised. "No, we pulled it out together." There was no lock, only a loose lid covered with dust. Inside were old newspaper clippings, property records, and a faded photograph of the house taken years before either of us had met. Standing on the front porch were Luke, Caleb, and a third young man I had never seen before. Caleb had one arm around Luke and the other around the stranger, all 3 smiling at the camera. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in blue ink, were the words, "Ashwood Summer Festival." 1 week before everything changed. Luke's smile vanished the instant he read the handwriting. He carefully took the picture from my hands. "This should not be here." Before I could ask who the third man was, someone knocked loudly on the front door. Luke opened it to find Travis standing on the porch, his usual confidence replaced by visible tension. "We need to talk," Travis said. "Now." Luke stepped outside and quietly closed the door behind him. But the kitchen window was slightly open. I could not hear every word, only scattered pieces carried by the breeze. "He found the photograph," Travis said. Luke answered, "That changes nothing." Travis lowered his voice, but one sentence reached me clearly enough to make my heart stop. "If Noah learns why Caleb trusted you that night, he will never look at you the same way again." I watched Luke stand perfectly still, saying nothing in return, and for the first time since arriving in Ashwood, I realized the greatest secret inside that house might not have been hidden behind the locked door at all. Luke did not mention the conversation with Travis after he came back inside. He simply carried the old storage box into the hallway closet and closed the door, as if putting the memories out of sight could also quiet the questions growing inside my head. I wanted to confront him immediately, but every time I looked at his face, I saw the same exhausted sadness that had been there since the day I arrived. Whatever had happened years ago was still happening to him in ways I did not yet understand. The following Monday, I stayed late at the publishing office finishing a deadline. By the time I walked toward the parking lot, the sun had already disappeared behind thick gray clouds. My phone buzzed with a message from Luke. "Do not walk home. I am coming." Before I could answer, another voice called my name. I turned to see Travis leaning against his patrol vehicle. "Long day?" he asked with an easy smile that somehow felt less genuine than before. I nodded politely. "Luke is picking me up." Travis folded his arms. "He likes taking care of people. It helps him forget the ones he could not save. His words landed heavier than he probably intended. You keep saying things that only create more questions, I replied. Then ask him why Caleb left the house the night of the fire, Travis said quietly. Ask him who Caleb trusted more than anyone else. Before I could respond, Luke's pickup turned into the parking lot. The moment he saw Travis standing beside me, his expression hardened. He stepped out of the truck and walked over without raising his voice. We are leaving. Travis looked directly at him. You cannot protect him forever, Luke answered with a calm certainty I had never heard before. I am not trying to protect him from the truth. I am trying to protect him from your version of it. The drive home was painfully silent. Rain tapped against the windshield while Luke kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel. Finally, I broke the silence. Who was the third man in the photograph? Luke's grip tightened slightly. His name was Evan. Was he Caleb's friend? Luke stared at the road ahead for several long seconds. He was the person Caleb loved. I felt my breath catch. Luke continued before I could interrupt. Caleb trusted me enough to tell me before anyone else. I was the first person in the family who knew he was gay. I looked at him in disbelief. Then why does everyone in town think you hate people like me? He let out a slow breath that sounded almost like surrender. Because after Caleb died, it was easier to let them believe I was cold than explain how badly I failed him. We pulled into the driveway just as the rain grew heavier. Neither of us moved to get out of the truck. For the first time since we met, Luke turned toward me with completely unguarded eyes. Noah, he said softly. There is one part of that night I have never told anyone. Before he could continue, the headlights of another vehicle swept across the windshield. Travis's patrol cruiser rolled slowly to a stop behind us, and he stepped out holding a thick manila envelope as though he had finally decided the past had waited long enough. Luke stepped out of the truck before I could stop him. Rain soaked through his shirt within seconds, but he did not seem to notice. Travis remained beside his cruiser, the thick manila envelope tucked beneath one arm. Neither man raised his voice. Somehow that made the moment feel even heavier. I stayed inside the truck with the window lowered just enough to hear them over the rain. You should have destroyed these years ago, Travis said quietly. Luke shook his head. I should have told the truth years ago. Travis held up the envelope. The investigation was closed. The town moved on. Caleb is gone. Why reopen everything now? Luke looked back toward me through the windshield before answering. Because someone else is paying for my silence. Those words settled over me harder than the rain. Luke reached for the envelope, but Travis hesitated before finally handing it over. Without another argument, Travis returned to his cruiser and slowly drove away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the trees. Luke climbed back into the truck and rested the unopened envelope on the dashboard between us. For nearly a full minute neither of us spoke. Finally he slid it toward me. Read it. Inside were copies of old witness statements, newspaper articles, and photographs taken after the fire that had changed everything. Near the bottom was a handwritten letter signed by Caleb. My hands trembled as I unfolded the faded paper. Luke, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell everyone myself. I wanted you to know first because you have always been my safest place. I glanced toward Luke. He was staring through the rain-covered windshield, unable to meet my eyes. I continued reading. Caleb wrote about falling in love with Evan, about dreaming of leaving Ashwood together, and about believing his brother would eventually understand. The final paragraph stopped me cold. If anything ever happens, promise me you will never let fear decide your life the way it almost decided mine. I carefully folded the letter. You knew, I whispered. Luke nodded. I knew. Caleb trusted me. I told him I needed more time before we told the rest of the family. I thought I was protecting him. Instead, I let fear make every decision until there was no time left. His voice cracked for the first time since I had met him. After the fire, people started inventing stories. Some blamed Caleb. Some blamed Evan. Others blamed anyone who was different. I never corrected them because I believed I did not deserve to speak for him anymore. Tears gathered in my eyes before I realized it. So everyone thought you hated people like me because you never defended Caleb. Luke slowly nodded again. Every ugly rumor became another punishment I believed I deserved. I reached across the seat and placed my hand gently over his. He froze, looking down at our hands as though he had forgotten what kindness felt like. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers slowly closed around mine with quiet uncertainty. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply two lonely people choosing not to let go. Then Luke looked at me with a vulnerability I had never seen before and said, "Noah, I spent years believing I had lost my chance to become the kind of man my brother believed I could be. Then you walked into this house, and for the first time since Caleb died, I wanted to try again." The next morning the rain had disappeared, leaving the air crisp with the scent of cedar and wet earth. For the first time since I moved into Luke's house, the silence between us no longer felt like a wall, felt like peace. We spent the weekend doing something neither of us had planned. We opened the last room together. Sunlight poured through the dusty windows as we carefully packed away old boxers, wiped years of dust from the shelves, and placed Caleb's photographs where they could finally be seen instead of hidden. Luke carried the cassette recorder into the center of the room. He pressed play one more time, and this time he let the recording finish. Caleb's cheerful voice filled the room with memories instead of sorrow. At the end of the tape, there was one final sentence neither of us had ever heard because Luke had always stopped the recording too soon. "If you are listening all the way to the end, that means you finally forgave yourself. I hope one day you let someone else into this house too." Luke closed his eyes, smiling through quiet tears. "He knew me better than I knew myself," he whispered. A month later, the Ashwood Summer Festival returned for the first time since I had moved into town. Instead of avoiding it, Luke asked if I wanted to go with him. As we walked through the streets together, people greeted him differently than before. Rumors had slowly faded after Luke chose to speak openly about Caleb during a community remembrance gathering. He never tried to rewrite the past or excuse his mistakes. He simply told the truth. He spoke about his brother with pride, instead of silence, and he apologized for allowing fear to speak louder than love. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others thanked him. Many simply listened. That was enough. On the way home, we stopped at the hardware store and bought fresh paint, flower seeds, and lumber. Over the next several weeks, we transformed the forgotten room into a bright art studio where I could work every day. The faded blue cloth that had once hung on the door became a small framed keepsake on the wall beside Caleb's photograph. Luke planted new flowers beneath the front porch windows exactly where he told me Caleb always wanted them to grow. One quiet evening, we sat together on the porch watching the sunset turn the sky shades of gold and orange. Luke reached into his pocket and placed the old brass house key in my hand. "The first day you came here," he said softly, "I gave you this because you needed a place to stay. Today, I want you to keep it because this is your home if you still want it to be." I looked at the weathered key resting in my palm before looking back at him. I stopped feeling like a tenant a long time ago. He smiled, the kind of genuine smile I had only imagined when I first saw the photograph of him and Caleb together. Without saying another word, he gently took my hand again, and this time there was no hesitation in either of us. The story of Ethan and Luke may have come to an end, but countless other stories are still unfolding around us, each adding another colorful piece to the larger picture of life. Every person we meet is fighting battles we may never fully understand. Luke's fear and prejudice were shaped by unresolved pain, while Ethan's patience proved that understanding can sometimes achieve what confrontation cannot. Should Ethan have stayed, despite being judged from the very beginning? Compassion is admirable, but no one is obligated to remain in an environment that harms their emotional well-being. Sometimes walking away is also an act of self-respect. Before judging someone, remember that every heart carries a story. Choose empathy whenever you can, but never forget to protect your own peace. True healing begins when we replace assumptions with understanding, and when we find the courage to face the pain we've been hiding. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with Blue Fox BL. We truly appreciate your support and hope this story gave you something meaningful to reflect on. If you're listening tonight, we wish you a peaceful night and a restful sleep. And if you're listening while working or going about your day, we wish you a wonderful day filled with happiness, strength, and many good things ahead.